Okay, welcome everyone to Breakout Room 1, Round 2. I am Sabrine Baig from University of Delaware, and I will present this paper on digitization and development, property rights, and allocation of land and labor. The motivation for this paper is the fact that there are large productivity gaps between rich and poor countries, so much so that the yield is up to 3 to 4 times in the rich countries as it is in the poor countries. Some of the recent literature has pointed to the role of misallocation of factors of production in this productivity gap. So,
Sabrine, sorry, I think I don't see slides moving. I don't know about others.
Oh, okay. Probably true for others too. So I'm gonna make it like this. Is that working now?
Yes.
Okay. Productivity can be raised by up to 50% in the manufacturing sector by reallocating factors of production to their most efficient uses. In the agricultural sector, this gain can be up to 2 to 3 times, suggesting that the scale of misallocation might be larger in the agricultural sector than in the non-agricultural sector. And so much of the literature has focused on the extent of misallocation and productivity gaps. And I want to sort of focus on the sources of the degree of misallocation. There is correlation and theoretical evidence pointing to the role of land markets in misallocation. The empirical challenge remains that land markets do not function exogenously, and so thinking about sort of a natural experiment that shocks land markets would allow us to look at their effect on allocation of factors of production. Some of the existing work trying to get this causal evidence looks at contexts where property rights are communal or non-private, and sees how and so land markets are completely absent, and sees how the markets respond due to legal changes. Whereas even in contexts where property rights are private, low property right security might lead to frictions in the land and labor markets. And so in this paper, I'm going to study a context where there are private property rights, but there's tenure and security, and try to see the effects of a reform that I will argue increase tenure security through centralization of land records on allocation of factors. So prior to the reform, land rights are pretty manually held, and so these are handwritten land records that are sort of updated again manually and held in local offices that are making this sort of system prone to both insecurity for the poorest members, landowning members, as well as prone to errors. The reform is going to sort of take all of these manual records and digitize them as a first step. And so the first part of the reform is computerization of land records. The second part of the reform is sort of holding these records centrally at the sub-district level in these service centers where records are maintained and automatically maintained, as well as transactions are automatically processed. And so you can walk up to one of these as a landowner or as a tenant, walk up to these service centers and obtain a title if you're a landowner, or just verify your tenancy status if you're a tenant. So I'm going to exploit sort of a staggered rollout of the program across parts of the province to get its effect on the market, on land markets, as well as labor allocation. So before I get to the results, I'm just going to ensure that the timing of the program is not correlated with prior levels or changes in the outcomes of interest. And so these are just balance tests. And the very first thing that I will try to look at is the effect of this reform on property rights security. And what I see is title ownership goes up significantly. This is sort of confirmed in the administrative data, where a lot of landowners as well as tenants do visit these service centers, and for the most part are trying to get a title or just verification of their ownership or tenancy rights. The rest of the 10% of transactions that happen here include inheritance or division of land, those kinds of transactions, or sort of obtaining a title for access to credit or a legal case. And so the big results that I find due to the program is this movement in the land market. So I see landowners increasing rental market participation by about 25%. There's an increase in renting out land, which is consistent with a reallocation of labor in the labor market, where I see a drop amongst landowners in farming activity. So landowners rent out land and start farming less, or in other words, move to non-agricultural activities. On the flip side, there's an increase in the scale of farming. So for houses that stay in farming, their farms are larger. And there's also this movement in the land market is consistent with a reallocation of land towards a more efficient allocation. So the land moves, due to the rental market activity, moves from lower to higher productivity farmers. And there's also this underlying labor reallocation happening. Even though I cannot classify people in terms of their productivity in the non-agricultural sector, I do see this movement of landowners away from farming to non-agricultural activities. And as a result of all this, I see an improvement in aggregate production. So I'm kind of 2 minutes over time, so I will leave this slide up and pause or stop and take questions. I'm gonna try
to. Sabrine, can I have a question now?
Yeah.
So just following up on these other findings, you said that you find that landowners move to non-agricultural activities, and overall output goes up. So is it kind of within villages that people start performing other tasks than farming, or maybe also you find some evidence of people migrating to urban areas more willingly because they are feeling more secure about the land holdings they have?
Yeah, so there's another very cool paper by Elaine DeJeannery and co-authors in Mexico that looks at migration. I don't have very, very good measures of migration. And so I know what people are doing. They could be doing that outside of their village or in their villages. And they are most of these landowners start operating businesses. Some of these businesses are large. I can't really say if they are moving to the city to operate these businesses or not, because I don't have a very good measure of migration. But from this other paper that I'm talking about, some of these effects could be sort of this movement towards the urban sectors, or just movement of individuals towards urban areas.
Sabrina, I have another question. Perhaps I missed it. I was on and off. What's the evidence that you find in terms of trading, kind of increases in land trading after this? Is this consistent with other studies that look at kind of the impact of property rights on asset consolidation, etc.? I'm thinking of the case of Peru. That more generally talk about the impact of giving property rights to these people, which in a sense here you're formalizing the property right. They have it, but you're making it more formal. So I was wondering whether your results kind of line up with those too.
So there's sort of two answers. First, again, the property rights sessions focus a lot on improving property rights security on investment and less on sort of the market effects. There's some literature on looking at credit access and those things. So I think I would try to push this more in the latter, sort of in the whole theory about property rights, is that securing them should remove transaction costs and improve frictions and sort of fuel the market, both on the rental as well as on the sales market. And so in terms of what I do find is that the ownership structure doesn't change. So we don't see that so people are holding on to land and are not able to sell it because of lack of property rights. That margin doesn't respond. I don't see any action on transfer of land, like buying and selling of land. Most people have their land and it's typically inherited and they just keep it, that market is much slower to respond. I do see market response in terms of rental. So landowners do rent out their land, and typically just all of the land that they own. So, they shift entirely from farming to something else by renting out the land that they own. And there's further sort of avenues for exploring that, but because some of these lands might be very small because of inheritance and might just not be very useful for farming, whereas it can be used by an existing farmer to increase the scale of their farming. I
think that's a super interesting margin to think about land consolidation. There is a big push to try and, we know that land consolidation is many times beneficial. So, if just by digitizing these things, you're generating land consolidation, the rental market at the end is a way of doing that.
Yes.
I think this will be very interesting. I was just wondering, there is a literature on the impact of formal markets and formalization of property rights on productivity, etc. So I was wondering, whether your numbers line up to those or not. But anyway, I think the effects on land consolidation are interesting on the rental market.
Okay, yeah, I should check kind of in terms of the magnitude of effects if that is true. But yes, so there is a sort of almost a 15% increase in the size of farms. The farms are very small. There's under 10 acres. The average farm is about 7 acres, and I see about an increase of 1 acre. So we aren't really getting close. You're thinking about mechanization and those things. We're not really getting yet at a level of consolidation where mechanization becomes very productive. But there is certainly a sort of evidence of movement towards consolidation in larger farms.
Can I hop in and build on that question a bit? Oh, sorry, Dietrich. I think I might have. I'll be fast. So I also wanted to ask a little bit more about the renters market, and in particular, do you have any measures of whether these renters are using land differently? And the two dimensions in particular that I'm really curious about, one is like technology adoption and mechanization, per the Foster-Rosenzweig paper on scale. And then the second dimension is, like, if you think about land as a semi-depreciable resource in terms of like nitrogen fixing and phosphorus fixing, do you see that the farming is more intensive and somehow less sustainable?
That is a really neat question. So unfortunately, I don't have very, very good data on sort of trying to see technology, what kinds of technology people are using. I do have some rental, in terms of what inputs people are using, I do know how much they're spending on rental inputs. Typically, most rental inputs include like rental of tractors or harvesters. And so that goes up, which sort of points us, gives us some confidence that they might be movement towards other forms of technology or more modern forms of technology, which is again something to be expected as you see an increase in the scale of farming, and also sort of movement, this reallocation where people who are left in farming are presumably the more productive farmers. And other input usage is again constrained by data, but I do see movement in terms of what people are planting. So people move towards sort of shift. There's a shift in crop choice. And so the spillovers to land quality and things like that would be something interesting to think about if people are moving into rice, whether that's more intensive use of land assets relative to cereal, some other kind of cereals. It's really weird, these breakout rooms. I have to find the person who's asking the question. Yeah.
Sabrina, I'll just start talking. So Julia and I asked almost 99% of what I wanted to ask, which was perfect. My one question was just what kind of scale is the productivity increase? Is it a 2% increase, 10%? Like what kind of numbers are we talking about?
I have some measures from in the 20 seconds from remote census and administrative data on output, and I would say it's in the under 10%, so the 5% increase in aggregate sort of vegetation, up or 0.1 standard deviation, around that range.